policy. The census is the catalyst of American public policy. It shapes voting districts, and it determines how your public schools will get funded. Because this data is used in myriad democratic and economic functions, it's critical that we get it right. Unfortunately, the 2020 edition might be in trouble, which has caused concern among experts for the integrity of the country's most authoritative dataset. The census is centuries old, but this story starts at the conclusion of the 2010 census. The Bureau had shot past cost estimates on its way to the most expensive census per capita of all time.
So in 1970, it cost $16 to count each housing unit, and in 2010, it cost around $92 to count each housing unit. And this is all in 2020 dollars.
That's Robert Goldenkoff. His office rated the 2020 census on its list of government initiatives at a high risk of failure. A key reason? The funding just isn't there. Congress limited the budget for the 2020 census to the amount spent on the 2010 census.
The nation is getting more complex and less willing to participate in the census. And because the Constitution requires a complete count, the Census Bureau has to do more work in order to obtain that complete count.
So why might it cost more to count certain groups? This scene from the episode of Master of None gives some clues. It follows a cab driver back to his apartment, where he's living with at least 3 other adult men. So this one apartment contains 4 distinct households, a region of notoriously hard to count tracts. Census tracts are designated hard to count for many reasons. They could be full of renters, or they could have an abundant homeless population. Topographically complex regions are hard to count, as are tracts with limited access to broadband internet.
It's the people at the margins of society, more impoverished, don't speak the language. Then we have procedures to try to compensate for that.
Mr. Pruitt would know about the challenges in taking a census. He was director during the year 2000 count.
The last 2 to 3% of a census is very expensive.
Further complicating matters, a new proposal to change the census could further increase costs and affect response rates. The Department of Justice requested that the Bureau add a question about citizenship to the short form decennial census.
The argument in the letter is that the Justice Department wants better data on where citizens are in the country in order to enforce the voting rights laws.
The citizenship question already appears in the American Community Survey, which collects data annually. It just goes to a much smaller portion of the country.
I can only do consequences, and I can say the consequences of acting as if you need this for the Voting Rights Act is inconsistent with the fact that it already exists.
A more complete data set on citizenship could give the Department of Justice more granular data to work with, but that would depend on an adequate response rate, and the national political climate might make that more difficult. Some people have expressed fear that the government might use census data to aid deportations or otherwise harm their communities.
We have experience in American history where being counted in the census did result in painful consequences for the Japanese who were interned.
Americans today have a historically low level of trust with their government. That fact paints an unsettling portrait.
Certainly today's environment, if you told the authorities where a lot of undocumented people live, the authorities would, I think, take advantage of that piece of information. That's their job. I think the chances of having anything like a complete census, if we have the citizenship question, is simply not the case.
There are proponents who favor a mainstream citizenship question. The general argument is that census data are used to apportion seats in Congress and distribute funds, but the Constitution requires the census to count for all persons. That's because the census is a survey of an economy that includes the contributions of residents who aren't citizens.
The stakes are whether we care about representative democracy. The inequalities already, economic inequalities, are severe. If you duplicate economic inequalities with political inequalities, then you simply have a different kind of society, and it's not a democracy.